Understanding ecosystems. One of the main ideas behind permaculture is that you're trying to understand the function of a natural system and replicate that understanding within a production system. And if you're going to do that effectively, you need to know a little bit about how ecosystems work, what is the structure and composition of ecosystems, and based on that understanding, how does that guide your production system and your objectives within that production system. So there's big picture and there's details as far as understanding ecosystems go. The big picture is that on Earth there is an energy flow through those systems that is constant. There's energy going into it from the sun, and there's energy being radiated out to space eventually, and that's a one-way flow of energy. It's not recycled, it doesn't it can't be used indefinitely, so it's not a long-term renewable, I guess, resource, because the sun will eventually run out and that flow of energy will stop. But what biological systems try to do with that flow of energy is maximize its productive use. So biological systems organize themselves in their amazing complexity and diversity in a way that captures as much of that energy flowing through that system as possible and transforms that energy or makes use of that energy to organize biological complexity within that system. So I've talked a bit about it already. You know, the energy origin is the sun, is from the sun, and that's going to flow through that system, and the biological system wants to hold on to as much of that energy as possible. So we'll flow through. So biological systems want to create a functional diversity to hold on to that energy. So originally that wasn't possible really, as the energy from the sun swept across a baked and parched early Earth landscape. There wasn't much opportunity to harness that energy into the complexities of interactions between living things in that environment. So it's only really until it's only really until there was this union between cells that created a eukaryote type of cell. So there was early kind of bacterial cells that could do different things, got combined to create a new type of cell, which was a eukaryote cell. And that new type of cell had chloroplasts within it, which were bacteria once, that could harness that energy from the sun and transform it into sugars. So that was a process called photosynthesis. So once plants once cells evolved the ability to photosynthesize, so to capture sunlight and transform it into biological molecules like sugar, then that provided a food source which other cells or early cells could use to consume, and that was kind of like the building blocks to creating the biological complexity. So once you start having those interactions developing, groups of cells started organizing themselves into more complex organisms, and you had this whole race for survival. So you had the one type of cells which were the producers, which could make their own food through photosynthesis, and then you had the other group of organisms which were consumers that were busy eating those producers, and through those interactions you then got ecosystems start to evolve and develop. So once cells harnessed ability to photosynthesize, that then created the opportunity to take solar energy and transform it into biological molecules through photosynthesis. Creative ability to transform into biological molecules. Okay, and once that foundation was established, then, as I was saying before, you've got the consumers eating those producers, and you've got diversity in those producers to try to make the best use of capturing the solar energy, but also avoid being eaten by the producers. And this diversity of interaction creates the platform from which evolution emerges from. So certain species will have certain traits that will have some sort of advantage, and then you get this great explosion of diversity of life. And the idea behind that great explosion of diversity is that you're trying to make the best use of capturing the energy flowing through that ecosystem by creating this biological complexity. So biological complexity develops to harness and store the energy flowing through it. And transform it into living food webs. Okay, so that's one main idea, that in an ecosystem there's energy flowing through it, and biology has evolved the complexity within ecosystems to try to capture as much of that energy and use it to create this complex diversity within it. And by doing that, you're creating this great output of all these different products. And in an agricultural sense, if we also try to create that diversity that makes the best use of the energy flowing through that system, we are providing the opportunity to get the most production from that system. So the more we try to simplify and just monoculturalize our production systems, the less we are able to make use of the energy flowing through that system, because there's not that functional complexity within that system to spread and slow down the energy moving through it as it goes through that system pretty quickly. So we want to recreate this functional complexity as much as we can within our systems. Okay, the other idea is matter is recycled. So the matter that was first there in the formation of Earth is still there. There's some off-gassing of certain elements into space, but gravity holds much of our atmosphere around our Earth, so there's not much that escapes Earth. The energy changes form and eventually flows out into space as heat radiation, but the matter is being constantly recycled. So the other big picture idea to understanding ecosystems is that there's certain processes that are going on to recycle the matter and make it constantly available for living systems to incorporate into their materials and to create that complexity within those systems. So matter is never lost, but constantly recycled. And it's recycled in different things that we'll look at. So it's recycled within carbon cycles. So that's how you can get carbon as carbon dioxide go into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide can be absorbed by plants. The plants can put that carbon into, through photosynthesis, the plants transform that carbon dioxide into sugars. Those sugars can be put into the soil to feed the microorganisms in the soil, and that draws carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it into the soil. over thousands of years, as those carbons degrade, they form oil and coal and gas that we can then extract as a source of energy. But the carbon cycle is the process where carbon is moving from the atmosphere into the hydrosphere or the water, into the lithosphere or the earth as soil, into the biosphere as sugars and other biological molecules that are being changed between living things. So matter is never lost but constantly recycled within carbon cycles, water cycles, there's nitrogen cycles. Just about any type of matter that you look at, so any of the elements that are on Earth, whether it's carbon, water, nitrogen, whatever it might be, they all go through cycles. So they don't just stay in the biological systems, they move into the soil, they can move into the water, they can move into the air, and that cycling makes them constantly available for life to be able to make use of those materials to construct living organisms. So that's the big picture. The details of it is that within each ecosystem you can divide it into the abiotic or biotic factors, and the abiotic factors are the non-living components of that system. So I'll put that up here, non-living components. So that would include things like water, soil, rock, temperature, rainfall, humidity, altitude, distance from equator. So combined, they create the conditions of a particular environment. Okay, so if you look at a particular environment, so if you're looking where I am now in Wanganui, the abiotic factors of this environment are how far we are from the equator. So we're about 32 degrees latitude, so that means that it's quite seasonal here. We have fairly big changes in season between winter and summer, not too extreme, quite moderate, but you do get those big, those seasonal fluctuations in daylight hours and hours of sunshine. And that's going to have a big impact on the living things in that system, because it's going to impact, you know, the temperature and the hours of sunshine mainly. Soil and rock types. So soil is coming from the type of rock materials that are in that environment. As they get eroded away, they're creating the substrates from which soil is primarily made of. You got temperature, again, depending on how far it is from the equator, but also its altitude. The higher you get, the colder it gets. The rainfall of a particular area, its humidity, distance from the equator, distance inland. So we're quite close to the ocean here, which means we're moderated by the temperature of the ocean. So instead of getting too hot in summer or too cool in winter, the temperature of the ocean doesn't change very easily because it's a very big body of water, and water doesn't like to change temperature very quickly. So that helps moderate the temperature on land that's next to the ocean. So and we've got quite good rainfall because we're getting westerly winds, and those winds are traveling across the Tasman Ocean where they're humidified, and they drop that rainfall over New Zealand when those winds pass over us. So we get quite consistent rainfall during the year. So it's these elements here that form the habitat of a particular environment. And when you're looking at an ecosystem, you're often fine-tuning that to a particular type of environment, like a forest or a pond or a river or a lake. And these abiotic factors you can also fine tune to that particular environment. So a forest has particular macro scale abiotic factors, but then micro scale. So in a forest it will have certain light intensity depending on where you are placed in that forest. There'll be a change in the humidity because the trees are transpiring. The temperature will be moderated a bit by the trees buffeting the wind that might change the temperature more quickly. So it's creating the framework for the living conditions within that environment. And then you've got the biotic factors. So the biotic factors are the interactions between the living elements in an ecosystem. So those interactions could be predation, they could be mutualistic, and then you've got the biotic factors in that system. So the biotic factors are the interaction between all the living elements in that system. And as those interactions, they could be predation, or they could be mutualistic, or they could be commensalistic interactions. And what they all are doing is creating the biological context in which a particular organism experiences within that habitat. And that can be changed depending on the influx of species, so the migration of species or the eradication of species. Our own impact on ecosystems tends to be one where these biological factors are constantly changing because we're introducing species into those systems. We're eradicating other species that are more specialized or more vulnerable, and changing the biological context in which the species within an ecosystem experience. That's really impacts that ecosystem for them and determines, their abundance and success within that environment. So the biotic factors are really understanding the interaction between the living elements of an ecosystem that creates the context that an organism experiences within that environment. In summary, for an understanding of the ecosystems, you can see that energy flows through a system from the sun, is captured by living things by photosynthesis, is spread between those living things by consumption as they eat each other. That matter is being recycled between different spheres of the Earth, so between the Earth and the atmosphere and the hydrosphere and the biosphere that we're going to go into in a sec. And an ecosystem can be divided between the abiotic factors, which create the habitat. They're the non-living things like temperature, humidity, altitude, and the living aspects, which are all the living things that are in the ecosystem, and they create the context in which an organism experiences and it will evolve in response to. So what will try to eat it, what food is available, what competition is there, they're all the biotic factors, and it's in response to those factors that an organism will evolve to over time. So to get a better understanding about how matter is being recycled on the Earth, we'll just quickly go through what the spheres are on Earth. So they're the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere. And each nutrient or molecule will be recycled between those spheres so that it's being constantly made available to the biosphere to help support life. It can't just stay there, it's got to be recycled between the different spheres. We'll look at some examples of that with the carbon cycle and the water cycle. But the biosphere is the living things on Earth. So they have their own interactions. There's the consumers and the producers, but they are the living organisms, producers, called producers because they can produce sugar through photosynthesis, or consumers, and they're the guys that eat the plants because they can't make their own food like the plants can, so they've got to eat the plants on Earth. So that's one sphere, is everything that's alive on Earth. The other sphere is the hydrosphere, which is all the water on Earth. And if you look at Earth, most of it's in the ocean. If you look at what isn't salt water, so the fresh water, most of that is frozen at the poles. And then whatever is left over from that mostly is groundwater, so you can't, it's not running fresh water. But a very tiny fraction, about 1% of all the water that's on Earth is actually running fresh water that is available for extraction by us to support our agricultural production. So most of our hydrosphere is not really available to us. It's tied up in the oceans or the frozen in the poles. So a hydrosphere is all the water on Earth. And about 1% of that is available to us as running fresh water. Okay, and the lithosphere. The lithosphere is the Earth so it's the solid. So if you have a look at Earth, it's what Earth is made out of. So it's the crust, it's the mantle, it's the core, it's all the different layers of the Earth and the composition of those layers. So it's the solid composition of the Earth. And the atmosphere is the gases that surround that solid structure of Earth. So if this is our Earth, the atmosphere is a thin layer of gases that surround the Earth. And you can think of it probably like an eggshell, I guess. So if you think of an egg, it's got a thin little shell around it. That thin little shell for Earth would be its atmosphere. Thin layer of gases surrounding Earth. So the importance of this for the ecosystem is that any material, so whether it's water, whether it's carbon, or whether it's a nutrient like nitrogen, is being recycled between these different spheres and refreshed in the process of doing that, purified in the process of doing that, and made available in forms that will support life. So we'll look at that in the context of a carbon cycle and a water cycle, just to see how these nutrients can be recycled. And it's our understanding of the recycling of those nutrients which help guide our construction of our biological production systems. So to help demonstrate how matter is recycled within ecosystems, we'll just quickly look at the carbon cycle and water cycle. The carbon cycle is quite topical importance at the moment because of the threats of global warming associated with carbon dioxide being added to the atmosphere. So what we're doing at the moment, as far as global warming goes, is increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if you have a look at the Earth, the way our atmosphere works is that it acts as like a glass house. So there's radiation of heat from the sun, and that's quite high intensity heat. And as it hits the Earth and the oceans absorb that heat and they re-radiate it out. So this is re-radiated heat. And a lot of that heat is absorbed by the gas molecules that are in the atmosphere and re-scattered in all directions. So one of the components of heat is as it gets absorbed by living matter, and it speeds up the movement of that living matter, and then they re-radiate that heat out again. So all of these molecules in our atmosphere are re-radiating that heat in all directions, and that traps a lot of heat in the atmosphere. So the gases trap heat in our atmosphere. So if you increase the concentration of the gases in the atmosphere by increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide, for example, you also trap more heat. So you trap more heat, and that warms up the atmosphere, warms up the Earth, and there's problems associated with that due to different species being able to survive in different places. They could potentially migrate to different areas, but if that migration means that they are hitting human habitations and cities and townships, then they can't migrate as they would like to, and therefore they're trapped in areas that are changing in ways they don't like, and they can't evolve quickly enough to make those changes, so they go extinct. So one of the threats with global warming is that species will go extinct because their environment changes in ways that they can't evolve quickly enough to, and they can't migrate because of being trapped by human developments, so they go extinct. And there's changes in other systems. If the ice in the poles melts, the sea water rises, and that creates opportunities and threats. One of the threats it creates is it will flood a lot of our cities that are in close proximity to the coastline. So that's bad news for us. And I guess in a nutshell, the problem with global warming is that because we've established all of these resources and cities and towns, changes in the status quo threatens the stability of all of those constructions that we've made. So if we can't be dynamic and flexible in how we respond to changes in the environment, then we will suffer as a consequence of that. So one of the, that's the main threat of global warming, is changes in the environment that threaten wildlife and threaten us. And that's ties in with the carbon cycle, is that what causes the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is carbon being extracted from deposits in the soil, and that's deposits such as oil, gas and coal, and they were once living things. A lot of them were created in the what's it called, Cretaceous. There's a period of Earth I'm thinking of. Oh, it's eluding me. What is it? Cretaceous, Carboniferous. Bingo. These deposits were largely created in the Carboniferous period. So there was a period of Earth's history where there was a great abundance of plants, and particularly in swampy areas, and they pumped out a lot of oxygen into the atmosphere, creating all these anomalies like giant insects because there was so much oxygen available in the atmosphere. But anyway, as all these plants died and decayed in these swampy environments, they were transformed. All the carbon that was in their body structures was being transformed over thousands of years into oil, gas and coal. And we're extracting that carbon out of those deposits, and we're burning it as fossil fuels, and we're putting it into the atmosphere, where it's going to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide and increase the ability of our atmosphere to trap and store heat, which will lead to global warming and changes in sea level and various threats to the biosphere. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon between the atmosphere as carbon dioxide into the biosphere. So that can happen as plants absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis transform that carbon dioxide into sugar, and then take those sugars and make them into proteins and fats and other carbohydrates that other living things can then eat, or they can use to construct their leaves and stems and other parts of themselves, into the biosphere through photosynthesis. Plants can then take those sugars that they make, put it into the soil as soil exudates to feed the microorganisms that they rely on to give them in exchange minerals. So that carbon can then go into the lithosphere, into the ground. so which can be put into the lithosphere as exudates, and when the plants die, as they decompose, and when the animals die. And as that ground erodes, the carbon that's in the ground can be eroded and be deposited into water, so it can enter into the hydrosphere. So erosion can move carbon into the hydrosphere. And the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere can also be absorbed into the oceans or lakes or other elements of the hydrosphere, so it can move from the atmosphere into the hydrosphere. So what you're getting here is this picture of how carbon can move between the different spheres of the Earth as it's changing type from one form to another. And how that's of primary importance to us is how it's associated with global warming as the concentration of the gases increase. But there's hope. There's a great thing we can do within our agricultural system is speed up the rate at which the carbon dioxide is being taken out of the atmosphere and being put into the soil as plant exudates. So we can speed up the process through intentional design, the rate at which plants are taking the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. And the great news is that the more carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere, and the warmer the Earth becomes because of global warming, the faster plants will grow, and the faster plants will actually do this process for you. So it's one of the checks and balances that occur within the Earth to help maintain the levels of carbon within the atmosphere and the soil at pretty constant levels if we don't interfere with it too much. As if it gets too warm and there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's just going to speed up the rate at which plants can extract it and put it back into the soil again. So we can intentionally design systems where they're constantly building up the soil and storing carbon in the soil, and in the process making that soil richer and more healthy by intentionally creating environments which are maximizing the potential of plants to photosynthesize and store it as exudates into the soil. And that process plays in perfectly with agricultural systems, because the healthier and the faster